Have you ever wondered what it was like to be a woman with big dreams in the year 1270? Imagine a world where your talent was undeniable, your skill honed, yet invisible to the very institutions that governed your livelihood. What shocking walls stood between a woman and her guild ambitions in the bustling towns of 1270? Number 10. Loss of rights upon widowhood remarriage. Picture this: you are a skilled artisan, a baker perhaps, known for your exceptional bread in the city of Bruges. Your husband, a master baker, passed away last year, leaving you with his workshop, his tools, and the precious right to continue his trade under the protection of the Guild of Bakers. For a year you have managed the business, perhaps even improved it, your hands stained with flour, your mind sharp with calculations. You employ apprentices, manage the ovens, and deal with suppliers, all under the watchful, often grudging, eyes of the male masters who still hold the official power in the guild. You have demonstrated undeniable competence, proving that a woman's touch can be just as strong, just as precise, as any man's in the heart of a busy workshop. But now, after a respectable period of mourning, a new suitor appears. He is a good man, kind, and he offers stability, a chance for companionship in a harsh world. However, he is not a baker. In fact, he is a cartwright, a member of the Guild of Wheelwrights, a completely different craft with its own distinct rules and traditions. This is where the invisible, yet crushing, weight of the 13th century social order truly descends. For a woman in your position, remarrying outside her late husband's guild often meant sacrificing the hard-won, temporary privileges she had gained as a widow. It was not enough that you had kept the business afloat, that you had maintained the quality of the bread, or even that you had provided for your children. Guild, in its rigid adherence to male lineage and patriarchal structure, often decreed that your rights to operate the bakery, to use its esteemed guild mark, or to participate in its limited, informal capacity would be dissolved upon your remarriage to a man from a different trade. The logic, as far as it existed, was rooted in the guild's desire to maintain control, to prevent what they perceived as dilution of their craft's identity, and to ensure that the economic advantages of guild membership remained within what they considered the proper male line. They saw your business not as yours by right of skill or effort, but as an extension of your deceased husband's identity, a temporary custodianship until a more suitable male figure could take over. Imagine the agonizing choice. Do you choose personal happiness and a new life with a loving partner, knowing it will mean the complete abandonment of your professional identity, the very essence of your working life? Do you give up the thriving bakery you have nurtured, the apprentices who look to you for guidance, the reputation you have painstakingly built? Or do you remain a widow, forever bound to the memory of your past life, for the sake of economic independence and the continuation of your craft? The historical records, though sparse on the emotional toll, hint at this profound dilemma. For instance, a careful reading of the municipal ordinances from Strasbourg around 1270, often contained within large volumes of hand-copied laws, reveals clauses that explicitly state the cessation of a widow's trading rights if she chose a second husband not of the same craft. These rules were not always universally enforced with brute force, but they hung like a shadow over every widowed woman's decision, a constant reminder of her precarious economic standing. Guild's power was not just economic, it was deeply social, dictating not only how one worked but also how one lived and loved. It was a power that sought to contain women's ambition, even when that ambition was born from necessity and proven through remarkable resilience. Your bakery, once a symbol of your resourcefulness and strength, could become a commodity, transferable or reclaimable by the guild, simply because you chose to share your life with a man whose hands shaped wood instead of kneading dough. Potential for loss was immense, and the freedom of choice, as we understand it today, was a luxury rarely afforded to women in the bustling, yet restrictive world of the medieval guild. The very notion of a woman making her own way, independent of a male guildsman, was often antithetical to the established order, and this particular rule served as a powerful tool to enforce that deeply ingrained societal preference. It reinforced the idea that a woman's economic life was always secondary, always conditional, always dependent on the male hierarchy that governed the world of trade and craft. Number 9. Exclusion from higher crafts. Imagine yourself in the thriving city of Paris, perhaps the year is 1270. Possess a keen eye for detail, steady hands, and an artistic flair that makes your sketches of intricate designs truly stand out. Your dream is to work with precious metals, to shape gold and silver into dazzling jewelry, or to craft ornate chalices for grand cathedrals. This is the world of the goldsmiths, a truly elite craft, one that commanded immense respect, significant wealth, and direct connections to royalty, nobility, and the powerful church. Here's the harsh reality that would immediately confront you. The doors to such prestigious guilds were firmly, unequivocally, and almost universally shut to women. The concept of higher crafts was not just about the monetary value of the materials or the final product. It was deeply intertwined with social status, political influence, and even perceived intellectual complexity. Crafts like goldsmithing, manuscript illumination, stone masonry, advanced metalwork beyond simple smithing, and even certain specialized forms of apothecaries or legal scriveners were considered the exclusive domain of men. These were professions that required extensive, formal apprenticeships, often spanning many years, and culminating in the creation of a masterpiece to prove one's skill before a council of existing masters. For women, access to such formal, documented training was almost non-existent. Guild statutes such as those detailed in the Livre des Metiers, Book of Trades, compiled in Paris by Etienne Boileau around 1268, meticulously laid out the requirements for entry into various crafts, and while some mentioned wives and widows in ancillary roles, they conspicuously omitted any pathways for women to become independent masters in these elevated professions. There was no mention of a woman presenting a masterwork, no provision for her to take on apprentices under her own name, and certainly no allowance for her to vote in guild affairs or hold office. The reasons for this exclusion were multi-layered and deeply rooted in the medieval mindset. Firstly, these crafts often involved heavy physical labor or dangerous processes that were deemed unsuitable for women, a simplistic and often inaccurate generalization, as many women engaged in physically demanding tasks in other trades. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly, these crafts were often conduits to power and influence. Goldsmiths, for instance, frequently served as bankers, moneylenders, and trusted advisors to the elite. They handled vast sums of money, possessed knowledge of financial transactions, and were privy to sensitive information. Allowing women into these circles would have meant ceding a degree of control and influence that the male-dominated guilds were simply unwilling to relinquish. It was a matter of preserving a male monopoly on prestige and power, camouflaged under the guise of tradition, physical suitability, or the perceived delicacy of women. Moreover, the training itself for these higher crafts was often cloaked in secrecy and ritual, passed down through male lineages. Workshops were not just places of work, they were social hubs, places where alliances were forged and knowledge was jealously guarded. The idea of a woman participating in this closed, often fraternal, environment was considered alien. While a woman might spin wool in her home or bake bread in a small communal oven, she was not expected to oversee a complex goldsmith's workshop with its dangerous crucibles and precious, easily pilfered materials. This exclusion wasn't just about economic opportunity. It was about denying women access to the pinnacles of creative expression and financial independence within the urban centers of medieval Europe. Even if a woman possessed unparalleled talent in design or an innate understanding of metallurgy, her path to becoming a recognized master in a higher craft was blocked by an invisible wall of societal norms and guild regulations. Potential contributions of countless skilled women were simply lost to history, their talents diverted to more acceptable domestic tasks or relegated to the unseen, uncredited labor within a husband's workshop, forever beneath the glass ceiling of 13th century guild life. Perpetuated a cycle where women's work, even when skilled, was devalued and unseen, preventing them from accumulating capital, gaining social standing, or truly innovating within the most lucrative and respected sectors of the medieval economy. Number 8. Prohibition on solo travel for trade. Imagine the bustling docks of London or the vibrant markets of Florence, circa 1270. Merchants, typically men, would undertake long, perilous journeys across land and sea, establishing trade routes, negotiating deals for wool, spices, timber, and other valuable commodities. These journeys were not just about logistics. They were about building relationships, understanding distant markets, and securing sources of raw material. Now picture yourself, a skilled woman from a family involved in the textile trade, perhaps a weaver or a dyer. You have an exceptional eye for quality, a sharp mind for figures, and a natural ability to bargain. You believe you could secure better dyes from distant German towns or higher quality wool from English pastures, significantly boosting your family's enterprise. But a deeply ingrained social limitation, almost an unspoken rule backed by custom and occasional local ordinance, made solo travel for trade virtually impossible for women. This was not always a formal guild statute, but rather a powerful social construct interwoven with the realities of medieval life and the perceptions of women's safety and propriety. A woman traveling alone, especially over long distances and through unfamiliar territories, was seen as vulnerable to attack, robbery, and perhaps even more damaging in the rigid moral landscape of the time, accusations of immorality. Her reputation, and by extension, the reputation of her family and their business, would be severely jeopardized. Dangers were real: bandits, rough roads, unreliable inns, and the lack of established legal protection for a lone female traveler. However, the societal perception amplified these risks, often suggesting that a respectable woman simply did not venture out unaccompanied for such purposes. Guilds, while primarily focused on the craft itself, often reinforced these social norms. While a master merchant might send his wife or daughter to a local market to sell goods, dispatching her on a weeks-long journey to a distant fair or a foreign city was unheard of. The financial risks were compounded by the perceived social risks. A merchant's reputation was his bond, and any hint of impropriety associated with his family could undermine his standing. The records of merchant guilds, such as those from the Hanseatic League cities in the late 13th century, meticulously detail the extensive travel undertaken by their male members, but are conspicuously silent on female members engaging in similar long-distance trade. This silence speaks volumes. It implies that such an activity was not even considered a possibility for women within their sphere of influence. This limitation severely curtailed a woman's ability to expand a business beyond the immediate local market. Without the capacity to travel, she could not personally scout new suppliers, negotiate better prices directly with producers in different regions, or identify emerging markets for her goods. Enterprise was confined, geographically and economically, to the boundaries of her immediate community. She had to rely on male intermediaries, often guild members themselves, who would add their own fees and markups, thereby reducing her potential profits and restricting her access to diverse goods. It was a limitation that strangled potential growth and innovation. While women were vital to the production and local distribution of goods, the strategic, long-range aspects of commerce were almost entirely closed off to them. The road to financial independence, which for men often lay in the ability to traverse vast distances and exploit new opportunities, was effectively barricaded for women. They might toil diligently within the confines of their workshops or sell their wares at the town square, but the wider world of international trade, with its promise of significant wealth and influence, remained tantalizingly out of reach, guarded by the invisible but formidable barriers of social expectation and the very real dangers of travel in an unforgiving era. This restriction ensured that even the most ambitious and capable woman remained tethered to her immediate surroundings, unable to fully capitalize on the burgeoning opportunities of medieval long-distance commerce. Number 7. Wage disparity. Imagine a bustling workshop in the heart of a medieval town like Ghent in 1270, known for its thriving textile industry. Inside, the rhythmic clatter of looms and the low hum of spinning wheels fill the air. You, a skilled female weaver, sit at your loom, your fingers deftly manipulating the threads, creating complex patterns with precision and speed. Beside you, a male weaver, perhaps your husband, brother, or simply a fellow journeyman, performs the exact same task, using the same type of loom, the same quality of wool, and producing an identical length and quality of cloth. Yet at the end of the day, or at the end of the week, when the master distributes payment for the finished goods, you receive noticeably less for your equally accomplished work. This was the stark reality of wage disparity for women in medieval guilds and workshops. While formal wage contracts are rare and difficult to interpret from the 13th century, historical analysis of household accounts, guild records, and municipal ordinances strongly suggests a systemic undervaluation of women's labor. It wasn't always explicitly written in guild statutes that women should earn less, but it was an ingrained customary practice, a silent understanding embedded in the economic fabric of the time. Women were often paid at a lower rate, typically between half to two-thirds of what a man would earn for performing the very same task. This was true across a range of crafts where women were actively involved, from brewing and baking to spinning, weaving, and even certain types of manual labor. Justifications, if ever articulated, were rooted in deeply sexist assumptions about women's roles and economic contributions. Firstly, women's work, even when skilled, was often considered secondary, supplementary to a man's presumed primary income. It was assumed that a woman's income was not essential for the survival of the household, even if, in reality, her earnings were crucial to keeping many families from destitution. Secondly, it was believed that women's physical capabilities were inherently inferior, making their labor less valuable, despite clear evidence to the contrary in many physically demanding trades. Thirdly, women were often excluded from formal apprenticeship structures and full guild membership, meaning they lacked the collective bargaining power and protections afforded to male guild members. This exclusion left them vulnerable to lower pay, as they had no formal mechanism to advocate for equitable wages. For instance, detailed cost estimations from building projects in England around this period, though perhaps not strictly guild-related, consistently show women laborers receiving significantly less than men for comparable work, indicating a widespread practice of unequal pay for equal effort. This wage disparity had profound implications for women's economic independence and social standing. It meant that even a woman who worked tirelessly and competently was systematically deprived of the full fruits of her labor. It limited her ability to save money, invest in her own business, or achieve financial autonomy. It reinforced her economic dependence on men, whether a father, husband, or employer. It also devalued her skill and effort, making her work seem less important, less professional, and ultimately less worthy of respect. The very act of performing the same labor for less pay became a symbol of her subordinate status, even when her contribution was indispensable to the workshop's productivity. A woman could be the most efficient spinner, the most innovative dyer, or the most reliable baker, yet the value placed on her time and expertise was consistently diminished, simply because of her gender. This silent but pervasive limitation ensured that even when women were active participants in the guild economy, their economic power and potential for upward mobility were systematically suppressed, keeping them tethered to a lower economic rung despite their undeniable skill and hard work. It was a structural disadvantage that impacted every aspect of their financial lives, ensuring that genuine equality in the workplace was an aspiration light years away from the reality of 1270. Number 6. Dependence on male relatives. Imagine a young woman in the German city of Cologne, perhaps in the year 1270. She has a strong aptitude for craftsmanship and natural talent for intricate leatherwork, having spent her childhood observing her father, a master leatherworker, in his bustling workshop. She can distinguish between different types of hides by touch, knows the precise cutting techniques, and can even design complex patterns. Her hands are skilled, her mind sharp, and her desire to contribute is immense. However, her participation in the lucrative and highly regulated world of the Leatherworkers Guild is almost entirely predicated on her relationship to a male relative. She cannot simply join the guild as an independent artisan, pursue an apprenticeship on her own terms, or open her own shop without the explicit, and often very restrictive, connection to a father, husband, or brother who is a recognized guild member. This dependence was a cornerstone of the medieval guild system structure, particularly concerning women. Guilds were fundamentally patriarchal institutions, built on the principle of male lineage and continuity. Membership was typically passed from father to son, or acquired through a formal male-centric apprenticeship system. For women, pathways to participation were almost exclusively indirect. A woman might work extensively in her father's workshop, contributing her labor and skill, but she would rarely, if ever, be formally recognized as an apprentice or a journeyman in her own right. Her work was seen as part of the household economy, an extension of her father's or husband's business, rather than her own distinct professional identity. Guild statutes, such as those of the Tanners Guild in Oxford from this period, would meticulously list male members and their apprentices, but would often remain silent on the significant female labor within the household, thereby rendering it invisible in the formal economic structure. Upon marriage, a woman's economic identity, if she had any independent one, became subsumed under her husband's. She became his helper, his partner in the workshop, but rarely his equal in the eyes of the guild. Her right to work in a particular trade was often derived solely from her husband's guild membership. If he was a baker, she could bake. If he was a brewer, she could brew. But if her husband decided to change professions, or if he died, her right to continue working in that trade was often contingent on complex rules, as we discussed in the limitation about widowhood. It was a system that ensured women's economic activity was perpetually tethered to the presence and status of a male guildsman. Even when a woman inherited a workshop upon her husband's death, her rights were often probationary, limited to maintaining the business until a male heir came of age, or until she remarried, often with the aforementioned restrictions. She could not typically take on new apprentices in her own name, represent the guild in external negotiations, or vote in guild meetings. Her role was essentially that of a temporary steward, a custodian of the male lineage and its associated guild privileges. This deeply ingrained dependence meant that a woman's skill, ambition, and entrepreneurial spirit were always constrained by her marital or familial status. She could be the most talented craftswoman in the city, but without a male relative to act as her official conduit to the guild, her talents remained largely unrecognized, her potential severely limited, and her economic future perpetually precarious. This invisible chain of reliance on male relatives ensured that women, despite their undeniable contributions to the medieval economy, were always on the periphery of power and recognition within the guild system, their very livelihood a fragile construct built upon the foundation of male authority. Number 5. Voice and vote silencing. Imagine the Grand Hall of the Drapers' Guild in London around the year 1270. The air is thick with the scent of wool and the hushed murmurs of important men. Master drapers, influential figures in the city's economy, gather to discuss prices, quality standards, apprenticeship rules, and the election of new guild officials. This is where the real power lies, where decisions are made that directly impact every member of the guild, from the wealthiest merchant to the newest apprentice. Now picture yourself, a woman who has worked tirelessly in the textile trade your entire life. Perhaps you manage your deceased husband's drapery business, overseeing dozens of workers, or perhaps you are an independent yarn spinner whose livelihood depends entirely on the prices set by these very drapers. You possess intimate knowledge of the supply chain, the fluctuations in market demand, and the practical challenges of production. Yet, despite your expertise and vested interest, you are entirely, unequivocally, and systematically excluded from these meetings. You have no voice, no vote, and no direct say in the rules that govern your own economic existence. This systematic silencing of women's voices was a pervasive and often unwritten rule across almost all guilds in medieval Europe. Guilds were, at their core, fraternal organizations, brotherhoods established by and for men. Constitutions and statutes, such as those meticulously recorded in the Liber Customarum of London around 1275, would detail the rights and responsibilities of freemen or masters, but would never include provisions for women to attend or participate in formal guild governance. Even in trades where women were undeniably central to the workforce, like brewing, baking, and spinning, their contributions did not translate into political power or representation within the guild structure. The exclusion went beyond just voting. Women could not hold guild office, whether as wardens, deans, or masters. They could not sit on the councils that adjudicated disputes between members, set quality controls, or disciplined errant workers. They had no platform to advocate for their own interests, to challenge unfair practices, or to propose innovations. All decisions were made by an exclusively male body, often with little regard for the specific challenges or perspectives of the women who comprised a significant portion of the actual labor force. This meant that rules on working hours, pricing, quality control, and even market access were formulated without any direct input from the women who would be most affected by them. This lack of voice was a profound limitation, far more subtle than a prohibition on working, but equally devastating. It meant that women's economic lives were perpetually subject to the whims and biases of men. A new regulation was introduced that disproportionately affected female spinners or weavers. They had no formal avenue to protest or seek redress. Their only recourse was through informal channels, perhaps appealing to a male relative who was a guild member, or engaging in quiet, unorganized resistance. It rendered women politically invisible within the very institutions that governed their livelihoods. Solidified their status as economic dependents, even when their skill and effort were undeniably central to the guild's overall prosperity. The silencing of women's voices in guild meetings was a stark symbol of their secondary status, a constant reminder that no matter how crucial their labor, they were considered outsiders in the chambers of power, their opinions unheard, their needs unaddressed, and their future perpetually shaped by decisions made by others. It was a shocking limitation that stripped women of their agency and their ability to shape their own destiny in the bustling but rigidly structured economy of the 13th century. Number 4. Limited market access. Imagine yourself as a skilled brewer in a bustling medieval town like Ghent, Flanders, in the year 1270. Your ale is renowned throughout your neighborhood for its rich flavor and consistent quality. You have the knowledge, the ingredients, and the dedication to produce substantial quantities of this liquid gold. However, despite your capabilities, you find your market access severely restricted, far more so than your male counterparts. While men could typically sell their wares at the main market square, at lucrative trade fairs that drew buyers from distant lands, or even from established shops with prominent street frontage, your options are often confined to selling from your own home, through a small window facing a quiet alley, or perhaps at a less prominent, designated section of the local market. This limitation on market access was not always codified in explicit guild laws that stated women cannot sell here, but rather emerged from a complex interplay of formal regulations, customary practices, and social expectations. Guilds, especially those representing powerful trades, often controlled prime market locations. These locations were typically reserved for full guild masters, who were almost exclusively men. To have a stall in the main market square, or a shop on a busy thoroughfare, required not only rent but also guild approval and status, which women generally lacked. Even if a woman was running a business inherited from her husband, her right to occupy a prime selling spot could be challenged, or she might be relegated to less desirable areas. For instance, municipal records from cities like Bruges and Ypres in the late 13th century often show market stall allocations that heavily favored male guild members, pushing any female vendors to the fringes or to less visible corners. Furthermore, participation in the large, profitable trade fairs that connected medieval towns and regions was almost entirely a male domain. These fairs were not just marketplaces, they were networking events, places where merchants established credit, forged alliances, and gathered intelligence on broader economic trends. As we discussed earlier, solo travel for women was fraught with social and practical challenges, making their participation in these fairs almost impossible. This meant that while male merchants could tap into a regional or even international customer base, women were largely confined to local clientele, significantly limiting the scale and profitability of their enterprises. The consequences of this limited market access were profound. It meant that a woman's business, no matter how good her product, could never grow beyond a certain size. She could not easily expand her customer base, compete on a larger scale, or command premium prices that came with broader market recognition. Her business remained small-scale, domestic, and often precarious. This restriction also perpetuated the perception that women's economic activities were inherently smaller, less significant, and less professional than men's, even when they were the backbone of certain local economies, such as brewing or baking. Bustling streets, the vibrant central squares, and the distant, lucrative trade fairs were largely off-limits, creating an invisible, yet impenetrable, barrier to growth and genuine economic advancement for women in the year 1270. Their skill might be celebrated by their immediate neighbors, but their reach was curtailed, ensuring they remained local players in a world increasingly connected by broader commercial networks controlled by men. This was not just a practical inconvenience, it was a fundamental constraint that kept women from fully participating in and benefiting from the growing commercial dynamism of the High Middle Ages. Number 3. Apprenticeship barriers. Imagine a bright, eager young girl in the city of Bologna, Italy, in the year 1270. She lives above her father's flourishing parchment-making workshop, a place filled with the smell of treated skins and the quiet scrape of knives as scribes prepare their material. From a young age, she has watched, learned, and even assisted her father, developing a keen eye for quality and a steady hand for the delicate process. She dreams of one day becoming a master parchment maker herself, training her own apprentices, and perhaps even innovating new techniques. However, a formidable, almost insurmountable barrier stands in her way. The guild's formal apprenticeship system is almost entirely closed to her, both as a prospective apprentice and, even more critically, as a potential master capable of taking on her own apprentices. This limitation was devastating because the apprenticeship system was the primary gateway to guild membership, skill acquisition, and eventual mastership in medieval crafts. Guild statutes like those recorded for various crafts in Bologna during this period meticulously detailed the length of apprenticeships, the fees involved, and the responsibilities of both master and apprentice. These rules were almost always framed in terms of male participants. A master took on a boy or young man as an apprentice. While women might perform similar tasks within a family workshop, learning from their fathers, husbands, or brothers, this informal learning rarely, if ever, conferred the official status of a trained apprentice recognized by the guild. She would not receive the formal training certificate, nor would her years of labor count towards the journeyman stage or eventual mastership. Even if a woman somehow acquired the necessary skills, the most significant hurdle came in her inability to take on her own apprentices. Crucial privilege and responsibility of a master was to train the next generation of craftsmen. For women, this right was almost universally denied. If a widowed master craftswoman took over her late husband's workshop, she might continue to employ his existing apprentices, but she would typically be prohibited from signing new formal indentures in her own name. This meant she could not expand her workforce, could not ensure the continuity of her business beyond her own lifetime, and crucially, could not pass on her skills and knowledge through the recognized, legitimate channels. For instance, the statutes of the Paris Weavers' Guild around 1260 explicitly state that only a master weaver could formally take on apprentices, and while women were allowed to weave, they were not recognized as masters in this capacity. The implications of this barrier were far-reaching. It meant that women's contributions to a craft, no matter how skillful, were always seen as temporary, informal, and disconnected from the long-term perpetuation of the trade. It prevented women from building multi-generational businesses under their own name, from truly investing in the future of their craft, and from exercising the full authority and autonomy of a master. It also meant that many skilled women, despite their invaluable practical knowledge, could not pass on their expertise to others through the formal, respected channels, effectively limiting the transmission of female-honed techniques and innovations. This cycle ensured that the guild system remained male-dominated, as the very process of training and succession was primarily controlled by men. The inability to formally apprentice, and perhaps even more critically, the inability to take on apprentices as a master, was a shocking limitation that stunted the growth of women's businesses, undermined their professional standing, and perpetuated their exclusion from the very core of guild power and continuity. It was a barrier that silently but powerfully shaped the future of women's participation in the medieval economy. Number 2. Inheritance restrictions. Imagine a woman in the thriving port city of Genoa in 1270. Family has been deeply involved in the maritime trade for generations, particularly in the highly specialized and lucrative craft of sailmaking. Father, a revered master sailmaker, passed away recently, leaving behind a bustling workshop filled with enormous sheets of canvas, heavy ropes, and specialized tools. He had no sons, and you, his daughter, have been integral to the business for years, understanding every stitch, every seam, and every complex rigging detail. You know the trade inside and out. However, despite your invaluable knowledge and dedication, the inheritance of your father's workshop, and especially the full rights and guild status that accompanied it, were fraught with severe restrictions and often contingent on highly specific, precarious conditions for women. While it was not uncommon for a widow to inherit her deceased husband's workshop and continue his trade, this was almost universally an exception rather than a rule for daughters. In many guilds, especially those considered more prestigious or economically powerful, the inheritance of master status and full guild rights was strictly limited to male heirs. If a master had no sons, his workshop might technically pass to his widow, but it would rarely, if ever, pass directly to his daughter as an independent entity with full guild privileges. Guild's primary concern was often the continuity of the male lineage and the preservation of its male-dominated power structure. Records from cities like Florence and Milan in the late 13th century, which detail succession within various guilds, show a clear preference for male heirs, even distant ones, over direct female descendants when it came to transferring full guild mastership. Even when a widow did inherit her husband's workshop, her rights were frequently curtailed. She might be allowed to operate the business for a limited period, typically until a male heir came of age, or until she remarried, often with the previously discussed limitations if she married outside the guild. She was rarely granted the full panoply of master's rights. She could not typically vote in guild meetings, hold office, or formally take on new apprentices in her own name. Her position was often that of a temporary custodian, not an independent master with full autonomy. Her inheritance was conditional, not absolute. The very idea of a woman continuing a craft independently through direct inheritance from her father, without the intermediary of a husband, was largely an anomaly or restricted to very specific, often less lucrative, female-dominated crafts like spinning or brewing, and even then, often with informal rather than full guild recognition. The implications of these inheritance restrictions were immense. It meant that a woman's economic future was not secure, even within her own family's business. Her hard work and skill could be undervalued, as the business itself was seen as belonging to the male line, not to her as an individual craftswoman. It prevented the accumulation of wealth and influence across generations through female hands. It also meant that many thriving businesses, built on the foundations of women's labor and expertise, could be dissolved or transferred to less competent male relatives simply because of gender-based inheritance laws. A daughter who had spent her life learning and contributing to her father's trade could find herself sidelined, her knowledge and experience dismissed in favor of a male cousin who knew nothing of the craft, simply because of the prevailing patriarchal norms of the time. This was a shocking limitation that reinforced women's secondary status, perpetually tying their economic destiny to male lineage and ensuring that true intergenerational wealth and power remained largely out of their grasp, regardless of their talent or dedication. It was a system designed to keep women from truly owning their craft and their future. Number 1. Exclusion from mastership. Imagine a woman in the vibrant German city of Cologne, renowned for its skilled artisans and powerful guilds, in the year 1270. She has spent decades perfecting her craft, perhaps as an illuminator, creating breathtakingly intricate designs on parchment. Her hand is steady, her eye precise, and her reputation for quality is whispered among the scribes and scholars who frequent the workshops. She supervises assistants, manages supply lines for precious pigments, and understands every nuance of her trade. She performs all the functions of a master. Yet despite her undeniable skill, her profound experience, and her entrepreneurial spirit, the ultimate pinnacle of guild achievement, the title of master, and the full range of rights that came with it, remained almost entirely out of her reach. This fundamental exclusion was arguably the most shocking and pervasive limitation women faced in medieval guilds. The title of master was not merely an honorific, it was the bedrock of economic power, social standing, and professional autonomy within the guild system. A master had the right to run an independent workshop, to employ journeymen and apprentices, to use the guild's official mark, a symbol of quality and legitimacy, to buy raw materials at wholesale prices, and to sell finished goods directly to customers without intermediary fees. Crucially, a master also had a voice and a vote in guild meetings, allowing them to participate in setting prices, quality standards, and to elect guild officials. For men, achieving mastership was the culmination of years of rigorous apprenticeship and journeyman work, often requiring the presentation of a masterpiece as proof of their skill. For women, however, the path to mastership was almost universally blocked. Even in trades where women were the majority of the workforce, like spinning, brewing, or certain aspects of food production, the formal title of master was rarely, if ever, conferred upon them. While some guilds might make an informal allowance for a widow to continue her deceased husband's business, this was typically a limited, temporary privilege, not a genuine grant of master status. She could not train new apprentices under her own name, vote in guild elections, or truly represent the guild in external affairs. The position was often probationary, intended to preserve the workshop for a male heir, or until a male relative could take over. The very statutes of the guilds, such as those of the Bakers' Guild in London from the late 13th century, would consistently refer to masters as male, outlining a progression that simply did not include women. This exclusion had profound and far-reaching consequences. It meant that women, regardless of their talent or hard work, could never fully control their own economic destiny. Could not fully capitalize on their skills by expanding their businesses beyond the confines of a home workshop or a single market stall. They were effectively barred from accumulating the kind of wealth and influence that came with full master status. It relegated their work, no matter how essential, to a lower, less recognized tier of economic activity. The social implications were equally severe. Without master status, women lacked the social prestige, the political voice, and the independent legal standing that came with being a recognized head of a household and a pillar of the community. They remained perpetually in a subordinate role, their professional identity intertwined with, and dependent upon, that of a father, husband, or brother. The master's mark, a symbol of quality and trust, was a privilege almost exclusively for men, leaving women's products to gain reputation through word of mouth rather than official endorsement. The shocking reality was that a woman could perform every single duty of a master, possess every skill, and manage every aspect of a workshop, yet remain perpetually outside the inner circle of guild power and recognition. Talent was celebrated, perhaps, in the narrow confines of her clientele, but it was not acknowledged by the powerful institutions that governed the economic landscape of 1270. This systematic exclusion from mastership was not just an economic limitation. It was a profound denial of women's professional identity, autonomy, and their rightful place at the pinnacle of their chosen craft. It ensured that, despite their vital contributions, women remained perpetual apprentices in the grand workshop of medieval economic life.